So you want to take the leap to getting into wood turning. That's great, but it's hard to know just how much it'll cost to get started. In this video, I'll cover the equipment that you need to get started, where it's okay to cheap out a little bit, where you can find some free equipment, and how to use turning to buy new equipment going forward. Stick around. At the end of the video, I'll also price out my dream setup so we can do the wood turning equivalent of checking the Zillow listings in Jackson Hole together. I'm Brad Bond, this is Q Branch Woodworks. Let's get into it. Unfortunately, turning isn't a hobby where $100 and a dream are going to get you very far. You might get lucky with a piece or two of free equipment, but more expenses are usually right around the corner. It's a capital-intensive pursuit, but that doesn't mean it's not worth starting. It may be helpful to think of the amount that you want to spend getting started in wood turning in terms of one of these four levels. Tier 1, buy as little as possible. The idea here is to keep the total number of dollars that you spend as low as possible. Tier 2, turn your way forward. In this tier, you'll buy some decent stuff and then use that stuff to buy better stuff. Tier 3, selective premium plus high-speed steel. In this tier, you jump right into the mix with some medium-high tier tooling and high-speed steel tools. Tier 4, buy once, cry once. This is a fantasy build for a home shop where money is no object. Today, I'll cover each of these levels in detail and make specific recommendations for equipment within each of these tiers. I've also broken this video into chapters, so if you already know which tier you're in, feel free to skip right to it. I've also assembled some lists where I collect all of my recommendations for each tier. They'll be in the description down below. It's worth noting that I won't be talking about dust collection in the first two tiers. Each shop is different and each person is different. I don't want to make recommendations for a shop setup that may or may not work for you, so be sure to do your own research. Now, before we break down these four categories, let's talk about what you actually need to get started wood turning. First, you need a lathe. This seems obvious enough, right? Now, the features and sizes of lathes are too plentiful to go into too much detail in any section in this video, but I think it's fair to say that we all need something that spins wood around. The two biggest features we'll look at today are size and variable speed ability. Size will depend on your available space and your budget. The more iron you buy, the more expensive it will be. And don't buy something that's too big for your shop or you'll never even get it in the front door. Variable speed is a key feature as it will do two key things for you. One, it will save you a ton of time in the long run, changing speeds and belts and pulleys. And two, it will introduce new techniques, new finishes, and safer speeds for turning uneven loads. More on this later. Second, you're going to need a chuck. There are plenty of great videos out there showing how to turn just about everything under the sun without a chuck. These videos are awesome and their creators deserve full marks. That said, I'm a little bit biased here since I turn bowls and boxes mostly, but I think a chuck is an essential piece of kit. If you want to turn bowls and boxes and other things that need to be remounted multiple times during the turning process, chucks make this process safe and repeatable. If you're going to start wood turning exclusively to make baseball bats and rolling pins, maybe you can skip the chuck at this point, but I'd be willing to bet that you wind up bowl curious at some point. Turning tools come in two different varieties for the purposes of this video: carbide and steel. Many new turners these days start out with carbide tools, and there's a good reason for it. They don't require a sharpening rig. They're cheap and they're easy to use. In fact, many turners never give up their carbide tools for this very reason. They also don't have the complicated geometries that can make steel tools difficult to use for beginners. With carbide, there's no steep learning curve. Just keep the tool flat on the rest, take small bites, and before you know it, you're turning out work. When I started my own garage wood shop a number of years ago, I opted for carbide tools so I wouldn't have to allocate space for a grinding setup. Now, with all of that being said about carbide, if you're serious about turning, at some point you'll probably graduate to steel. Steel tools offer faster material removal and less torn grain, which ultimately means less sanding, which is a great thing. They also come in all different kinds of shapes and sizes that are perfectly suited for specific tasks. The downside with steel is that you'll need to make room in your shop and in your budget for a grinding setup. This includes a grinder and probably a jig. Now, you might be a natural at sharpening right out of the gate, but odds are, if you try sharpening freehand right out of the box, you're probably going to butcher your first couple of gouges, and that's no fun. It takes time to get them reset into a usable shape. A sharpening jig will keep you from fouling up your steel tools right out of the gate. It'll also give you the ability to make your gouges the exact same shape every time, which is important early on, especially when you're trying to build good muscle memory and good habits around the lathe. It's really difficult to get comfortable at the lathe if your tools are a different shape every time you go to use them. Next, you'll need some safety equipment. At minimum, I think that every turner should wear a face shield and a dust mask at the lathe. I'm sure you have a beautiful face, and we want to keep it that way. Even if your face isn't that beautiful, I'm sure it looks better than the free one they'll give you at the hospital when a bowl comes off into it. A dust mask helps protect your lungs. Wood dust is a carcinogen, and we want to keep as much of it out of your lungs as possible. Certain woods can even cause allergic reactions in people who are susceptible to them. A skin rash is one thing. A lung rash, not that much fun. Protect yourself with a dust mask from a reputable source. No leftover COVID t-shirt masks, please. Next, you're going to need to set up some consumables. Consumables are the things that you use up while you're using your lathe. Stuff like sandpaper, shop towels, finishes, wax, and yes, even wood. Eventually, you can get to a point where most, if not all of your wood is free. But in order to take advantage of your local city wood yard or your local arborists, you're probably going to need a chainsaw and a vehicle that's capable of hauling some serious weight. Those aren't really in the scope of this video, but keep them in the back of your mind if you decide to get really serious about turning in the future. For now, just know that you're going to need to keep some room in your budget for stuff that's going to get used up. Sandpaper and beeswax at an absolute minimum. It's not the most expensive stuff you're going to buy, but it's also not free. Now let's talk about extra shop tools. Unfortunately, your tool spending is not just going to be limited to your lathe. You're probably going to want something that can drill holes in blanks and round off the edges of turning blanks to save you time. Now, right out of the gate, you're probably not going to need the whole lineup from Powermatic, but you'll probably want a couple of small tools to help you out along the way. I'll detail what I think makes sense in each budget range at each tier as we go through the video. Okay, now that we've sorted out the basics of what you need to get started, let's start talking about the tiers, where you fit in, and how you can maximize your wood turning dollar. Tier 1, buy as little as possible. This tier is for my budget warriors out there. Whether you're a student, retired, on a fixed income, or you're just not sure if you're gonna like wood turning for the long term, there are things that you can do to stretch your wood turning dollar. Let's talk about them. The first thing I'd recommend doing is reaching out to your local AAW chapter, or whatever the wood turning governing body is wherever you live. There are a lot of us who have been turning for a while who have a lot of tools that we don't use that frequently, and we're generally willing to let them go to a new turner at a low price or even free. Free is sometimes nice because it helps us claw back some precious shop space. You're also likely to come out of your first AAW meeting with some new ideas and some sage advice from experienced turners, who you will learn are always willing to share their ideas. I think your best bet in this budget-conscious tier is to go with carbide turning tools. This will save you money on a grinding and sharpening setup. You can also extend the life of these little cutter tips at the end of your carbide tools by getting a diamond sharpening stone and some lapping fluid. I'll link in the description below to some videos about how you can use these to keep these running longer. Expect the carbide tools to run you from $50 to $70, the diamond sharpening stone to cost about $20, and the lapping fluid to run you anywhere from $10 to $15. Now, when it comes to lathes, you're probably just not going to get to be that choosy in this budget tier. What I will recommend is that you buy something that's been made in this millennium by a reputable brand. There's a lot of garbage out there in this tier, people who are trying to sell you lathes for $100 or $200, and these things can be more danger and more trouble than they're often worth. I've seen a lot of videos online of people trying to use cheap or outdated or just poorly made lathes, and it's a pretty scary proposition. Trust me, your fingers are a lot more expensive than any of the lathes on this list. The lathes I recommend in this budget-conscious tier are the Rockler or Central Machinery 5-speed lathe, which will typically run you between $250 and $300. Or the Shopfox W1704, which costs right around $300 at the time of the making of this video. The Rockler and Harbor Freight lathes are a little bit bigger than the Shopfox, but the Shopfox has variable speed, which will save you a lot of time in the long run. It's much easier to twist the little knob that changes the speed than it is to go digging in the back of one of these Rockler Central Machinery tools, changing pulleys with an Allen key every time you just want to switch from a bowl to a pen. Both lathes that I just mentioned are smallish and they have high minimum speeds, which means that turning anything even a little bit off balance is going to be a little bit harrowing. But they're perfect for small projects like bottle stoppers, pens, small rolling pins. They generally excel at small spindle projects. There'll be plenty to get you started. Now let's talk about chucks. This is another place where you can save a few dollars, but it's worth understanding that saving a couple of dollars here can actually cost you money in the long run. If you happen to buy a budget chuck that doesn't have the same jaw screw spacing or thread pitch as one of the major manufacturers, then you're basically just limited to whatever jaw options that offbeat company actually offers. Unfortunately, it's unlikely to be much. It probably will not cover all of your turning needs in the future. Now, with all of that being said, if you need to save a couple of greenbacks here, I have a couple of budget-friendly options for you. Number one is the Wen 4374 chuck set. It comes with a woodworm screw, which is actually pretty good for its price point of right around $90. The next chuck is the Nova G3 Lite, which comes in at about $120 to $130. This one doesn't come with a woodworm, but Nova has a ton of extra chuck jaws that you can bolt onto this thing later on. I think it's a great starter chuck set. Between these two chucks, I strongly recommend getting the Nova. It has enough accessories and aftermarket support that this is a chuck that you can grow into instead of out of. As far as safety gear goes, this is not the place to cheap out. Buy a UVEX safety shield and an RZ dust mask and forget about it. For consumables when you're just starting out, you probably won't need much more than sandpaper and beeswax. I'll link to some sandpaper and some budget-friendly finishes below, but just know that if you're buying a sandpaper variety pack thinking that you're saving money, any grits over about 600 to 800 are probably just wasted money. Nobody's going to be able to tell if your piece is sanded to 2,000 or 5,000 grit. In fact, there are some schools of thought that say that sanding beyond about 600 grit actually affects the penetration of some finishes. Don't worry about the higher grits. Focus on finding something that starts on the low end at about 80 or 120 grit and continues on up through anywhere from 400 to 800 grit. That'll be plenty for a beginner. Sticks of beeswax are also a nice cheap finish. You simply wait until your piece is spinning on the lathe, rub the beeswax in, rub it in with a shop cloth, and you're done. If it's good enough for Richard Raffin, it's probably good enough for the rest of us. Oils are a cheap and attractive finishing option. We'll see people talking in forums all the time about their Danish oil finish or their boiled linseed oil finish. The important thing to remember is safe handling principles. Drying oils can spontaneously combust, which means that piles of rags that have this oil on them can literally just light on fire. I promise you that your first bowl will not be worth burning your house down over. If you do decide to go this route with oil finishes, please be sure to observe safe handling and disposal recommendations. You can read the warning labels on the back of any of the packages that you buy, and it's also worth doing your own research to make sure that you're disposing of these rags safely. A pack of beeswax sticks will cost you around $7. Or if you're lucky like me and your local apiarist sells their beeswax at your local farmer's market, you can generally buy it by the pound for about 20 bucks. Ask them to break you off some and weigh it up, give them $5 or $10, and you'll be turning for a long time using this as the finish. A good variety pack of sandpaper varies pretty widely in costs, but I left some options in the description below that start at around $13. So to summarize for this budget-conscious tier, we have a low-end starting point of about $480 and a high end of about $570. I really wouldn't go much cheaper than any of this, but I think that getting a beginning turning setup for less than $1,000 is a pretty sweet deal overall. You might get lucky with some free or secondhand equipment on your local marketplace or from your local turning club, but remember what I said earlier about being careful about lathes that were manufactured long ago or were purchased cheaply to begin with. You'll also probably want a drill with a bit that matches your woodworm screw. There are plenty of videos online showing how you can set this kind of thing up, but if you already have a drill, that's great. All you need to do is buy a drill bit, generally 3/8, but make sure you check with your manufacturer. If you don't have a drill, a really nice one can be had for around $100. This is a cordless option from DeWalt. You can also pick up a cheap used cordless drill somewhere like Facebook or Craigslist or wherever your local marketplace happens to be. This is actually an okay place to cheap out as long as you're sure that the battery is in good condition. I've collected everything from this tier into a really easy Amazon list down below if you want to do some comparison shopping, so be sure to check that out after the video. Okay, now let's talk about tier 2. Turn your way forward. For this tier, the goal will be making money with your lathe as soon as possible to help fund future upgrades. We'll try to stay cheap-ish at the outset, but also try to set ourselves up for success in the long run. There are two major differences between tier 1 and tier 2. First, in tier 2, I don't think that you can afford to skimp too hard on the lathe or the chuck. I think that doing either may cost you more money in the long run and may actually stunt your growth as a turner. More on that a little bit later. Second, I think that for this approach, it makes sense to budget in a couple of project kits to help get you started. We'll talk about those as we get a little bit further into this tier. These project kits are cheap at the outset, but they help kickstart the money-making potential of your lathe. Let's assume that the safety equipment, consumables, and carbide tools are the same as they are for tier 1. Let's just set aside $125 in the budget for those. Let's take a look at what the next step up in lathes looks like for this tier. At the very least, I think that we should splurge a little bit here and try to get a lathe with a lower minimum speed. This will open up some options for you, like CA glue finishes for pens, thread chasing for boxes, some complicated types of multi-axis turning, and maybe even a little bit of green wood turning with some unbalanced pieces. Turning uneven pieces is a little bit harrowing on smaller lathes, but with a small step up in bench weight on these lathes, we can probably get away with a little bit more, which should open up a whole world of free material that you can use to start making money with this lathe. If you have some spare cash, I think it's also worthwhile to try to get a little bit more capacity in your lathe for your dollar. Here are my picks for the tier 2 lathes. The Jet 1221 VS, about $900. Now, I'm just going to read some specs for you guys. This lathe has 12-inch swing, variable speed with DRO, and a belt system for higher torque when turning bowls so you don't get bogged down. It comes with a full 1 horsepower motor and forward and reverse gearing for sanding. The next lathe is the Rikon 7150 VSR. This lathe costs around $810. It comes with a corded control box, which is actually kind of awesome at this price, a full 1 horsepower motor, DRO, 12-inch swing, and it allows outboard turning up to 15 inches, which is pretty nifty. If you can bolt this thing down to a bench, you can get some extra capacity out of it, which is pretty cool. It also comes with forward and reverse gearing for sanding, which is really nice for under $1,000. Overall, I think it's jam-packed with cool features for the price point. It's a very cool lathe. If I were starting over, this would probably be within my wheelhouse. The third lathe I'll recommend in this tier is the Laguna Revo 1216. It costs around $900. All right, I'm gonna need some glasses here soon. It comes with a 1 horsepower motor, super low minimum speed of 50 RPM, which is very, very cool. It allows outboard turning up to 16 inches. It has DRO, spindle lock, and indexing, which is actually super cool. You don't need to buy a separate indexing rig for this lathe. It's literally just like a spring and pin system on the back. So you can do divisions of, I wanna say it's like 12, 30, and 48 or something like that on the back if you wanna try your hand at fluting or segmenting or whatever have you. It has forward and reverse gearing, and the catalog of aftermarket support for this thing, and even the support from the manufacturer, is absolutely enormous. Like, I'll put a picture right up here, but you can turn this thing into a full beastly workstation if you really want to. Now, I'm a little bit biased because I own the Revo 1836. I like Laguna tools. They are not a sponsor. I pay for all my own stuff from them, but I think that the 1216 is a pretty sweet little lathe. Honestly though, I don't think that you can go wrong with any of the 3 lathes that I just mentioned. They all have forward and reverse, they all have plenty of capacity, they all come with a full 1 horsepower motor, which is really nice, especially at the low end. You can probably get away with the lathes that I mentioned in tier 1 here and tier 2 for a little bit if you're strapped for cash. Like, that's actually a pretty good way to save some money when you're moving up into this tier. But those 3 lathes that I just mentioned, they all have small business in a box written all over them. They'll give you the ability to turn a more diverse range of products that you can offer for sale. And the aftermarket support on each of them is good enough that they should be able to grow with you for years to come. All right, for the tier 2 chuck, I think that this one's pretty much over before it even begins. I think that Nova absolutely rules this price range for chucks. We'll talk about a couple of bundles that can help you get started, especially if you're looking to make money, but just for my personal experience, I think that this category is over. It's Nova. Okay, so the Nova 48293 Premier ProTech G3 bundle for $220. That's a mouthful, huh? Comes with pin jaws, 2-inch jaws, 4-inch jaws, and a woodworm screw. So this is plenty to get you started turning bowls from 4 inches all the way up to the maximum listed capacity of your lathe without any real issues. There are also a ton of jaw sets that you can buy for this chuck body in the future, so these make cheap upgrades to your actual turning capacity at any time. All right, the other chuck bundle that I would recommend is the Nova 48306 Lite G3 Pen Turning Chuck Bundle. I think that's supposed to say chuck, sorry about that. It's $175. Pen turning is a great way to get started making money. Just right out of the box with your lathe, you don't have to worry about big pieces flying around. You pretty much only have to worry about bushings and drill bits. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of pen turning kits as we get later into the project kit section of this tier, but I think that this turning chuck set gives you a really good head start on just making money as soon as you unpack it. One of the cool things about this chuck bundle is that it actually gives you what's called a mandrel saver for the tailstock, so it basically just wraps around your mandrel and keeps it from flexing. This is a pretty cool feature and actually saves you a little bit of money in the long run too, because you won't have to buy one of those in addition to your pen mandrel. That said, if you want to turn pens, you are going to need a pen mandrel. The good news is these can be had as cheaply as 16 or 17 bucks. For tier 2 turning tools, I still think that it makes sense to start with carbide, but I think that in terms of priority, there are two things that you should be looking to upgrade out of pretty quickly in tier 2. Number one, I think it makes sense to get yourself a decent bowl gouge and a spindle gouge, probably a skew, and then also start working your way into a sharpening setup. I'll talk a lot more about the grinder setup that I think you'll want in tier 3 when we get there later in the video, but I think that that's what you should be looking to graduate up to as soon as possible. Now, the carbide tools and the lapping stone and all of those things that I mentioned back in tier 1 will cost you anywhere from $100 to $120 depending on which set you get. And for that price, I think that you get a lot of turning capacity right out of the box. Especially if you're just starting your wood turning journey. By that I mean you don't have any built up skills, like you haven't been turning on your grandpa's lathe for 20 years and now you're trying to come over and use carbide tools when he has steel. I think that you're probably not going to miss any of the turning capacity that steel would give you by just starting out with carbide. I think it's important here to let your skills build up to the point where you feel comfortable around the lathe, and then you can start making upgrades. Let's talk about the extra shop tools you're going to want in tier 2. For most turners in this zone, I think that just having a good drill with a drill bit that matches your woodworm screw is an essential. Expect to pay about $100 for a decent cordless option. I'd recommend working up to a bandsaw as a second priority as well. A good bandsaw is going to give you the ability to turn free wood from felled limbs or just loose pieces around your neighborhood into turnable stock. And free wood plus turning equals profit. It's also going to help you round off corners of flat sawn pieces at the bandsaw instead of on the lathe, which saves you time. And as we all know, time is money. Because time is money, a decent bandsaw will save you a ton of money in the long run. It will also easily pay for itself in terms of salvaged material. Not having to buy all of your bowl blanks online, I mean, the cost is just incalculable. It's a great investment to make early on if you can. I think it's important here to make sure that the first bandsaw that you get has a cutting capacity of, I would say, at least 6 inches. This really opens up what free material is actually turnable material to you. For example, the first bandsaw that I bought only had about 3.5 inches of cutting capacity, which meant that even if I got a 4x4 for a home construction project that was slightly oversized, I still couldn't cut through it. It meant I needed another tool. Now, I'm not a bandsaw expert, so I'm not going to make any specific recommendations on the lower end of floor standing bandsaws here. I will say that after my lathe and my grinder, my bandsaw is my most used tool in my shop. I consider it an absolutely invaluable piece of wood turning kit. I strongly invest that you start looking at Craigslist and Facebook for one that's either in good shape already or that you have the knowledge and skills to repair on your own. Regardless, I wouldn't spend less than $400 on a new bandsaw under any circumstances. As far as safety and consumables go, the mask and the face shield that I recommend in tier 1 are still perfectly viable here. I'd probably just go with those again. There are some relatively inexpensive upgrades that you can make in the consumables department though, and one that I would recommend is soft sanding pads that chuck into your drill. These are an absolute lifesaver when it comes to sanding bowls. You're getting power on the lathe and power from your drill, and it cuts sanding time by a significant amount. These cost about $13 on Amazon or at your local hardware store, and if you can spring for it, strongly recommend them. The second consumables upgrade that I recommend, especially if you're turning pens, is Hut Perfect Pen Polish. Now, I think that they have a coarse grade and a fine grade of this, or maybe it's medium and fine, or fine and extra fine, or whatever. The case is that each of these bars costs about $7, and it actually makes a pretty darn good finish. And you don't just have to use them on pens either. Now, as near as I can tell, this is carnauba wax that has some kind of abrasive just sort of melted into it. Basically, you just rub it on at the lathe, same as you would with beeswax, and then use a shop towel to melt it in and smooth over your pieces. It's a lot cheaper and less fiddly than CA glue, I'm sure that when you're looking at your early projects, you're going to see CA glue finishes for bottle stoppers and for pens. And those are phenomenal finishes. They're super durable, really, really clear, do a good job of preserving the material. But if you're going to be turning cheap stuff like slimline pens or less expensive pen kits, I think it's pretty difficult to go wrong with the perfect pen polish. So for, I believe it's $14 or $15, you get both grades. And I think this is a no-brainer. I probably turned about 300 pens with this in my early days as a turner, and that's about how much I've used. So, I mean, just, I don't know, you do the math. That's gotta be like 9 million pens in there, right? Okay, really quickly, I just wanna go over some recommended accessories and kits that I think can get you started making some money with your lathe. Number one is a bottle stopper mandrel. Now these can be had for $16 to $25 depending on where you buy them. In my experience, they're pretty much all the same. I've probably owned 4 or 5 over the time that I've been turning. They're cool because they have this 3/8 by, I believe, 16 threads per inch threaded post on them. And a lot of different companies will make project kits that just thread directly on these. You can get brass inserts if you want to make a little bit more fancy. You basically bore out a hole in your piece of wood, drop the brass insert in there, and you screw these on and they screw perfectly flush. I think it's pretty cool. That said, if you're using a dense exotic hardwoods, you can pretty much just pre-tap and thread them specifically for this. Bottle stoppers, bottle openers, pizza cutters, cheese knives, I've seen all kinds of projects that use this as a base point. So I think this is a really nice jumping off point for making projects that aren't pens. All right, you're just gonna have to excuse this super dusty bottle stopper that I just dug out for this video, but the bottle stopper hardware itself costs $6 to $7, and that's for the stainless steel versions. You should always buy these from a reputable source online like PSI or Ruth Niles or stainlesssteelbottlestoppers.com. Beware the $1 bottle stoppers that you're going to see on places like Etsy and Amazon. The problem with those is that they have a chrome plating, and the problem with that chrome plating is that it is actually sensitive to alcohol and it can flake off. So you can imagine selling somebody a really nice African Blackwood bottle stopper, but with cheap hardware. Now imagine that they go home and put that in their $100 bottle of wine, and all of a sudden they have bits of chrome in their wine. It's going to be a pissed off customer. The next thing that I'd recommend buying if you're looking to make money with your lathe is some pen kits. Now, Penn State Industries does a great job of sort of pre-packaging these pen starter kits. You can actually just look at pen starter kits in their website and they'll come up with a bunch. Really, the idea is that in each pen there's a small brass tube of a specific size. So what they sell you is the bushings, the tubes, and the pen hardware to make those pens. I like these starter kits a lot because you don't have to buy one pen and then one set of bushings and then go out and find the drill bits or what have you. It's just all kind of packaged in there together. So these are a great way to get started making some money. Now, depending on your market or where you live in the country, you might find that the price that you can charge for a pen varies significantly. There are some shows that I went to early on where I could sell a slimline pen for $20 to $25, and some places where I was pretty lucky to get $10 for it. Even so, slimline pen kits typically cost anywhere from $1 to $3, so you're talking at the low end somewhere between $9 and $10 in profit for each one, supposing that you're not stuck selling at the absolute lowest end. The best part about turning pens is that you can batch them in bulk. So you can get a whole bunch of blanks, a whole bunch of tubes, glue them all up one night, let them dry out overnight, come back, and in one evening I think that I turned like 45 slimline pens in the space of like maybe 3 or 4 hours. It's not a huge deal to make a whole bunch of money with pens if you know where you're going to be selling them later on. Okay, so for tier 2, we have a low-end price of about $12.10 and a high-end price of about $17.50. Keep in mind that that high-end price includes a bandsaw of some kind at right around $400. For this price increase over tier 1, you get a ton of new capabilities with your lathe and chuck systems, and I think that alone is worth the price of admission here. There's nothing worse than watching a YouTube video about something cool that you can do with your lathe only to head outside and find that your lathe won't go slow enough, or it's not big enough, or it doesn't have that capability, or even worse, that you're gonna have to wait for an accessory to get delivered before you can try that thing that you saw. Spending this kind of money right out of the gate means that it will be your skills and not your tools that are holding you back in your turning. And that's a good thing. Your skills will improve over time with regular practice, but your lathe won't suddenly magically have a 20-inch swing when you wake up one morning. Getting the right tools up front also means that you get to try a ton of different things in your first couple of years as a turner. This is going to help you figure out what kind of turner you want to be and what you want to make. you won't be nearly as limited by your tools. Now, I know that $1,200 is no small chunk of change, but here's the way that I like to think about it. Every hour that I use my lathe, the cost of that lathe goes down. On a per hour basis, the more you practice, the cheaper it gets per hour. Consider it an investment in yourself. Okay, now let's talk about the next step up. Tier 3, Selective Premium plus high-speed steel tools. The goal of this tier is to break into the upper end of woodturning pretty much immediately without absolutely crushing your financial dreams for the future. We'll try to keep lathes right around $3,000 here. The reason we're going to stop at that price point is so that we can make a little bit of room for a decent sharpening setup. We also need a little bit of room overhead for all of these sweet steel turning tools we're going to get into. Let's talk about them. I can say that if you have the money for this kind of tooling, you also probably have a little bit of money for a class on sharpening, so I think this will all work out just fine. The major difference between Tier 3 and Tier 2 is allocating a little bit of extra money and space for a sharpening and grinding setup, and also the fact that you're going to need a couple of extra tools from the stainless steel pile to help get you started. Extra shop tools will also get an upgrade here, with a larger bandsaw to help match your larger lathe capacity. Lathes in this tier will have significant variability in terms of pricing and features, so rather than draw you a big, beautiful mind sort of grid with green check marks and red X's, I'm just going to show you a couple of premium options that I think make sense for this tier. Now, I'm also going to only recommend lathes that have a 110 volt option. You may be lucky enough to have 220 volts in your shop or whatever the European equivalent is, but I will say that for mine, it's always been occupied by a dryer. I know that when I was starting out wood turning, I wasn't willing to go digging in my walls or hire an electrician, so I'm going to assume that you aren't either. Now, you'll notice that none of the lathes I recommend here have a Reeves drive or a low minimum speed. I started out on the Grizzly G0462, and while it is a workhorse lathe, and I did enjoy using it, and in fact turned several thousand bowls on it in my time using it, it had a high minimum speed of about, stated by the manufacturer at 500, but really in my experience was much closer to 600, which meant that if I put half a log on there like I wanted to process most of the time, it started walking across my shop, which was dangerous and a little stupid. I still did a lot of it, but I don't recommend it. The high minimum speed of that lathe would be an absolute deal breaker for me at this point, so I don't think that we can afford to cheap out here. I wouldn't recommend something to you that I would be unwilling to use myself if I were starting over now. Now, as a side note here, all of the lathes that I'm going to mention here have detailed and nuanced enough reviews that are already on YouTube that I don't want to spend 30 minutes going over each of them. Pretty much everybody who's owned one of these has done a 30-minute write-up of some kind on them, and I would encourage you to watch all of them. Do your own research on these. This is just enough of an investment that I don't think it makes sense to take one person's word on it. Find somebody who's used each of these lathes for a long time, and be wary of anybody who doesn't actually list any downsides of any of these lathes. I can tell you, I own the Laguna Revo 1836, and one of the things that really grinds my gears about it is where the handles on the tool rest are positioned. They often knock into each other, and I don't know, for whatever reason, it just seems to be difficult to find a configuration where moving the banjo and moving the tool rest at the same time don't result in some sort of collision between the handles. So look out for reviews that have things like that. Okay, so here are my recommendations in this space. The Laguna Revo 1836. Again, super biased, but I liked it enough that I spent my own money on it, so take that for what it's worth. The Powermatic PM 2014. The Jet 719-500. And the Nova Galaxy DVR. Now, all of these lathes cost close enough to $3,000, and they all sometimes go on sale for a couple $100 less, so I don't think it makes a ton of sense to weigh these lathes based on what they may or may not cost at the time of the writing of this video. If $300 is going to make or break your entire setup, definitely shop sales. I know the Laguna does one towards the end of the year, might be around Black Friday. Powermatic does one every so often. Yeah, just shop around, be smart with your money. It's your money, not mine. All right, let's talk about chucks. Now, each of the lathes that I just mentioned comes with a 1 1/4 by 8 inch spindle, as opposed to most of the smaller lathes, which are going to come with a 1 inch by 8 spindle. Now, when you're stepping up to that larger size of spindle, I think that it makes sense to step up the size of your chuck as well. You're also going to want something that's sturdy enough to handle the things that you're turning with this new larger capacity on your lathe. That said, this is where battle lines are drawn in the wood turning world. I'm actually a little bit afraid to talk about it right now. So I'm a Nova guy, which basically in the religious wars around wood turning chucks makes me a Scientologist. Everybody else can't seem to really get along with each other, but they can all agree that I'm clearly out of my mind. So please don't necessarily take my words with too much weight here. I like my Nova. Other people have a lot of issues with them, so definitely do your own reviews here, but I'm gonna list a couple of options that I think should give you enough to at least do some YouTube searches and to ask at your local AAW chapter what the people who turn the most and have been turning the longest still really like to use. So these are, in absolutely no particular order, the Axminster Evolution, the Vicmark VM series, the Easy Wood Tools C2000. Okay, actually one quick note about the Easy Wood Tools. It has this really cool quick detached jaw system where you basically just like push a pin and you can slide a jaw out instead of having to deal with like a bunch of little screws. I think that's actually very cool. If I were gonna start over, that would be one thing that definitely factored into my decision on chucks. Just don't let the Vicmark guys hear me say that. Now, each of these chucks has features that make them industry leaders. Most of these companies have been around for a long time and they don't survive by making crap. So do your research and choose wisely. Godspeed. All right, now we're getting to the fun stuff. Steel turning tools. Steel tools have a steep learning curve compared to carbide tools. In my opinion though, the results speak for themselves. If you can afford to set up a sharpening and grinding setup and you have the time to learn how to sharpen and hone these properly and to use them properly, there's just no contest. Steel beats carbide every time. You get fast material removal. They offer multiple shapes and profiles depending on what you're doing. You get a great finish right off of the tool once you know what you're doing. Unfortunately, your beautiful steel will only last a couple of minutes in contact with the wood before it requires sharpening and touching up. So let's actually start this section of this tier with sharpening setups. The most straightforward wood turning tool sharpening setups are low-speed bench grinders paired with sharpening jigs, something like the Wolverine jig. Many companies make dedicated wood turning tool sharpening systems like whatever this is from Robert Sorby. But the bench grinder and jig system is time tested, it's pretty simple to set up, and generally it's pretty easy to use. The jig will set your angles and your protrusion, and the grinder actually does the material removal, the sharpening work. I recommend a low speed or variable speed bench grinder. Rikon and Grizzly both make pretty good ones in the $100 to $200 range that should be more than enough to get you started. Now, I swore that I would replace this Harbor Freight bench grinder system when it finally gave out, but it never did. So take that for what it's worth. 8-inch grinders seem to be the standard here in the US, so I would probably stick with that for your first grinding setup. The Wolverine sharpening jig costs about $100 and it simply screws to the platform underneath your grinding setup. There are plenty of videos showing how this all works together. I'll link to some in the description below. All told, you'll probably be in for $200 to $300 for your grinding and sharpening setup, at least your first one. CBN wheels can add anywhere from $150 to $300 per sharpening wheel to your sharpening setup. But if you don't know what these are, don't worry about them right now. As for the steel tools themselves, literal volumes have been written about grinding angles, gouge profiles, varieties of steel, and the voodoo magic of putting it all together and putting it to work on your lathe. I'll make this as simple for you as I possibly can. You are not tied to any one brand of turning tools. You can have a variety. It's okay. I will say, though, that cheap steel is almost never worth it. If you find a bull gouge online for $9.99 or $19.99, you're probably going to spend a lot more time sharpening it than you get to use it on the lathe. Remember, time is money, and time wasted is money wasted. I've purchased my fair share of cheap tools in the past, from Harbor Freight chisels when I first got my lathe to Savannah turning tools. They are all still sitting in some drawer somewhere in my shop. I don't use them. At all. Ever. Nobody else wants them. I don't want them. I can't give them to my friends because then they wouldn't be my friends anymore. Spend a little money here and avoid heartbreak later. Robert Sorby sells an 8-piece turning kit that retails for about $450, and it is worth every penny, in my opinion. In fact, my most used tool of all time is this Robert Sorby 3/8 inch bowl gouge. This was the first real steel tool that I ever bought. We're getting sort of down here in the flute. I've put several thousand bowls across this thing, and it's still going strong. I own tools that cost almost 5 times as much as this one that don't see half the use. Carter & Son is another company that makes excellent wood turning tools. They sell an Essentials tool package for $450 and an Ultimate tool set for $750, and I don't think you could go wrong with either. They're nicely machined, they arrive razor sharp right out of the box, and the polishing is of extremely high quality. It's also a father and son all-American operation, so what's not to love about that? I give their tools away on my Instagram every time I hit a follower milestone, and I pay my own money to do so, and I'm happy to do it. The tools are that good. As an added bonus, they could make a pretty formidable self-defense tool. Could come in handy. I hear good things about crown turning tools as well, but I don't use them enough to comment, so I'm going to let other turners evangelize on their behalf. I've also used tools from smaller companies like Glazer High Tech. Now, I found that they can be a little bit difficult to get a hold of, but the spindle gouge that I have from them is excellent, although I will say the flute is maybe a little bit long. They also seem pretty receptive to custom tuning tools to whatever your needs may be, so once you get a little bit more developed in the wood turning game, they're an option as well. Okay, let's talk about some of the extra shop tools that you'll want to add to your new wood turning empire. In this tier, I think that a good floor standing bandsaw is pretty much an essential. If you have to pay for every 16-inch platter blank that you ever want to turn, this hobby is going to get very expensive very quickly. You're going to want to start processing your own wood as soon as possible. And a bandsaw is one of the safest ways that I know to do that. Now again, a good bandsaw is a significant investment, but it will save you tens and tens of thousands of dollars in the long run versus having to buy kiln-dried lumber every time you want to turn a bowl. It'll help you turn branches and logs into bowls and boxes into dollars. Again, I'm not a bandsaw expert by any means, but I think that in this tier, it makes a lot of sense to graduate from a benchtop to a floor-standing bandsaw model. You'll also want to pay close attention to the power rating of the motor. Sawing through an 8-inch green chunk of hard maple is no easy task, and an underpowered motor may leave you with things like stuck and broken blades. Pay close attention to that power rating on the motor. Here are the bandsaws that I see other turners using frequently. Again, please do your own research here. Unfortunately, I do not have the money to purchase and review 6 floor-standing bandsaws for this video. The Rikon 10324 TG, the Laguna 1412 and 1412 BX, the Jet 14 SFX, the Delta 28400, and the Grizzly G0513. Okay, let's talk about chainsaws. Now, you don't need to get a chainsaw right away, but I think that with this much lathe capacity, you're gonna wanna start harvesting your own wood sooner than later. A chainsaw is going to help you turn a down tree or a log that you find somewhere into turnable wood. I'm not going to make specific recommendations here other than to say that with a 16-inch swing on your lathe, you're probably going to want at least a 20-inch bar on your chainsaw. I will also say that this is not the place to cheap out. Chainsaws scare me. They should also scare you. I use them all the time, and it's the scariest part of any part of wood turning that I do. Trust me, you want this tool to be rock solid, reliable, and safe to use. Buy and use all of the safety equipment for this tool. Foot guards, cut-proof pants, chainsaw gloves, helmet, face guard, earmuffs. For the love of God, protect your hearing around these things, especially if you decide to get really into chainsaws like I know some of you guys do, and you start doing things like boring out the muffler. Just wear your hearing protection, unless you want to go deaf later on. Look, the point is, don't buy the saw until you have all of the safety gear that goes with it. I want you to be wearing all of that safety gear the first time you even start that saw. Circle back to this piece of kit when you've gotten your feet wet with your other tools, but expect to spend a minimum of $500 for a decent chainsaw and probably between $100 and $200 for the bare minimum of safety gear that you should consider turning that saw on with. Let's talk about Tier 3 safety and consumables. Now, a face shield and a dust mask are still essential in my opinion, but I think that this is the tier where getting a dedicated dust collection system starts to make a lot of sense. With a small lathe, you can just drag it outside your garage if you want to turn and you don't want to be breathing all that sawdust. It's going to be a lot more difficult to do when your lathe weighs 300 to 500 pounds. I would say it's worthwhile if you have this kind of money to start thinking about a canister dust collector of some kind. Kent from Turn a Wood Bowl actually has a really nice video on lathe dust collection that I recommend checking out. You know where the link is. I also use a power respirator. This is the Trend Air Shield Pro. This is what I use in addition to my canister dust collector over there. And I think at this tier, it makes sense to start thinking about the low end of powered respiration. I like that there are no tubes or battery packs attached to this thing, so it's relatively lightweight. It's a smaller system. I can throw it in my trunk and just be good to go. It has filters underneath the hood here, and it has replaceable batteries, so I can run multiple in series if I'm doing turning demos or a couple of classes or just a particularly long session. I will say that when I wear this thing, I never have dust in my nose when I go to take a shower later, which lets me know that something about it is working. I use this in addition to my canister dust collector, and I turn the canister dust collector on literally any time that I'm sanding. I recommend you do the same. 3M makes a really nice PAPR system that retails for about $16.50. I know a lot of professionals that use this system, and they seem to really like it as well. If you can spare an extra $1,000 for this system, I think that investing it in your lungs' future is probably a good place to put your money. In general, dust collection systems should keep your shop air relatively clear, but I always like the added security of having another layer between the dust and my lungs. Okay, for consumables, let's be honest, it seems a little bit ridiculous to talk about a $13 pint of boiled linseed oil when we just spent $3,000 on a lathe and another $2,000 on a bandsaw, right? I'm not going to pretend that these costs don't exist. You will eventually need to buy some sort of finishes for your wood, but I think that in this price tier, we can think of them as more incidentals than anything else. We're not looking to scrape together $400 here. We're looking to scrape together closer to $4,000. So do your own research on your finishes. Again, if you didn't hear me earlier on, please be careful if you use drying oils. Those rags can and do self-ignite. That said, I will leave the preferred finishing methods in your shop up to you. To conclude tier 3, you can probably already tell if you've been tracking along at home that this tier has a much wider price range than the others so far. On the low end, we're looking at about $4,480. This includes a lathe, grinder, sharpening jig, chuck, full set of steel tools, and a floor standing bandsaw. If you add in a dust collector of some kind and you have a high-end hobbyist setup for somewhere in the neighborhood of $5,000. Honestly, $5,000 for a high-end hobbyist wood turning setup is pretty good when you think about it. Once you develop your skills a little bit, you can easily pay yourself back for all of this equipment with the time that you invest at the lathe. So on the higher end of this range, we have a total of about $8,210. So this will get you a very nice lathe, a nice chuck system, full set of Carter & Son turning tools, grinder, sharpening jig, 2 CBN wheels, a Laguna 14BX bandsaw, which is an absolute beast, a chainsaw and a full set of safety gear, and a Trend Air Shield Pro respirator. Figure in a nice dust collector, and you're probably tipping the scales right around $9,000 for what I would consider to be a viable low-end professional turning setup. Again, not bad for under $10,000. If you know that you want to get super deep into this hobby, or if you want to make wood turning a source of income for you, I think that the higher end of this tier makes a lot of sense. That said, either at the low end of tier 3 or the high end of tier 3, there really shouldn't be anything that's outside of you or your lathe's capability early on. Now, if cost is no object, you can still upgrade literally every tool that I just talked about. Let's get into it. Tier 4, buy once, cry once. Okay, so for this tier, instead of spending a lot of time talking through several options for every individual tool within the shop, I think we're just going to run through what my ideal setup would be if money were no object and I were starting from scratch and wanted like a mid-high-end professional turning setup right out of the gate. This should also give you a good idea of what you could potentially spend on this hobby, so keep that in mind when we go back to look at the costs for tier 3 and tier 2. Now, before the one-way apologists and VicMark acolytes jump into the comments below, this is just what I would do. I mean no offense to your pet lathe or brand or whatever wood turning family you belong to. But it's my pretend money and my video. So here we go. Okay, so for the lathe, I'm getting the robust American Beauty. I've had the opportunity to turn on these a couple of times and they are just incredible. Whisper quiet motor. I mean, it's spooky. I'll want it in 220 volts with the long bed and the 3 horsepower motor upgrade. Obviously, I'm getting the tilt-away tailstock with the gas shock assist and the outboard turning attachment. I want the bed extension, the lamp set, the remote foot on-off switch, the auxiliary 4-port outlet box, 110 volts each, the vacuum adapter, and what's this all been for if it's not on casters? I mean, come on. This brings me up to a cool $13,625 for this lathe alone. Tier 3 setup is starting to look downright budget friendly, isn't it? For the chuck, I don't have a strong preference here, just assume that I'll be paying about $1,000 for a big beefy chuck and every single jaw set that they make for it. So for steel tools, I did a little experiment. I went to the Carter & Son website and I just added every single tool with a handle to my cart. And it came out to $5,125. Honestly, this is kind of tempting in real life. Probably shouldn't shop online. For my bandsaw, I'm getting the Laguna 18BX. 3 horsepower, 16-inch depth of cut, which is ridiculous. I think mine tops out at like 8.5 inches right now. Literally doubling that capacity would be huge. It's also probably like 4 times as powerful. I don't think my bandsaw has a full horsepower in the motor. It also comes with magnetic start, a disc brake, etc., etc. It's a beast. Add in the casters and the bolt-on LED light for a total of $3,125. For my chainsaw, I don't need anything too crazy, so I'd go with the Husqvarna 592 XP. Comes with a 36-inch bar. I would probably back that down to about 30 inches just to overdrive it a little bit. Add in $300 for some basic safety equipment, and I'm out $1,850 for the saw. For safety and consumables, I'm going with the 3M PAPR system for $1,650. My Delta dust collector is getting an upgrade to the Laguna C-Flux system for a cool $2,000. Add $200 for hoses and connectors and small accessories like that, and let's just call it $2,200. So in conclusion, if I'm doing my math right, my dream setup would run me about $28,575. Now I could cut this down to like $24,000 by only getting the Carter Essentials tool set. That said, if we're playing with fantasy money, we might as well go for the gusto, right? If you know for a fact that you want to make wood turning a big part of your life going forward, this is the best setup that I could come up with for a home shop. Obviously, if you have space for a professional shop, your needs and your capabilities are going to be a little bit different, so this may not fit exactly, but I'm thinking like a 12-foot by 12-foot home garage. This is almost certainly exactly what I would do if I had 30 grand burning a hole in my pocket right now, which I do not. If you've come into a large inheritance or you're just really well off financially and you wind up doing this, please just send me pictures. Q-Branch Woodworks on Instagram. I want to see it. It's worth noting that no matter what tier you're in or where you start in wood turning, there are always going to be unanticipated costs. Things like the bench that you want to bolt your small lathe to. That's an unanticipated cost. What I will say is the biggest money suck for me in wood turning is seeing somebody else doing something cool and immediately wanting it for myself. Now this can be something small like an iron acetate finish. There's a few bucks for mason jars, a few bucks for some steel wool, a gallon of vinegar. That's not so crazy. Or there can be stuff that catches you completely off guard. Like when somebody shows you their Rose engine. I have about $6,500 into mine and it doesn't even really turn bowls. I mean, it's cool. I have some videos that you can watch on it, but money suck, big time. Other stuff can catch you off too. Probably the first year that I was wood turning, I asked a turner how he was getting a particular finish. I think I was still on my Harbor Freight lathe, and he told me that he was buffing his pieces. And so I went out and bought a buffing system for $100. It's $100 I wasn't planning on spending that day. I wasn't even in my shop when I spent that money. This kind of creep can catch you off guard if you're not careful. So if you need to be faithful to your budget, set a budget and stick to it. Good financial hygiene will reward you multiple times over in the future. Remember, your tools are not going to appreciate in value, generally speaking. So don't buy something at the cost of your future financial goals. There is, however, a case to be made for starting wood turning sooner than later. And it's because of the one thing that you can't make up for with money. And that's your skill. The time that you put in at the lathe is invaluable, right? Like we talked about earlier, the more time you spend on the lathe, the cheaper that lathe gets per hour. You spend $3,000 on a lathe and you put 3,000 hours on that lathe only costs you $1 an hour. The problem is finding those 3,000 hours. It's the one thing that you literally cannot buy with money is your experience. So for example, if the tier 2 turning package is within your grasp right now, but tier 3 is going to take you 5 years to save up for, I think in a lot of cases it makes sense to just grab the tier 2. The only thing you're not going to be able to make up is those 5 years of turning that you don't get to do. Sure, you might outgrow your tools someday, but there's no replacement for that time that you're going to get to spend on the lathe right now. As they say, the best day to start was yesterday, the second best day is today. The simple fact is that you don't even know what you don't know about wood turning right now. The things that you'll learn in your first 2 years of wood turning are way more important than 4 inches of swing on a lathe, I promise. If saving money is a slow process for you, I think it's generally more worthwhile to start turning earlier than later. Okay, enough preaching. Please don't forget to check out my tiered collections in the description below. I tried to organize everything as clearly as I possibly could to give you the chance to do some comparison shopping without having to wind up everywhere on Amazon and all other corners of the internet. Now that we've gone through all the tiers, I'm interested to hear what tier you think you're going to belong to. Go ahead and leave it in the comments below. Also, please be sure to include something that you're excited to turn when you finally get your lathe. Even if you're an experienced turner just watching this video for you-know-whats and giggles, I would love to hear what tier you currently are in your home shop. Right now, I'm like a tier 3.1. I have a Tormek grinder back here somewhere, but my bandsaw desperately needs an upgrade. So that's what I'm going to be working on this year, saving up and up for that new bandsaw, and also probably pouring more money into my Rose engine. If you've enjoyed this video and you found it useful, please do me a favor and consider subscribing. I make wood turning content like this, I make tutorials for tricky pieces, and sometimes I just turn something with no talking so that we can both enjoy the process. If you want to see the things that I turn personally, most of them don't make it to YouTube, so please head on down to my Instagram. You can also feel free to ask me any questions that you want over there. I make sure to respond to any and all direct messages. Also, following me on Instagram puts you in the running for some of those sweet Carter & Son tool giveaways that I do every so often. Next one probably at 20K when I hit that, which should be in the next couple of months here. So, see you on over on Instagram. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Brad Bond. This is Q Branch Woodworks. You are awesome. I'll see you on the next video.